Well, let's go to a fascinating book written by my friend Ed Griffin. And the reason I put this up here is because it has some sections in it from a book entitled British Agent, written by Bruce Lockhart. Bruce Lockhart had been sent to Russia after the Russian Revolution by a man named Lord Alfred Milner. Now, remember I told you earlier that Cecil Rhodes had left his vast fortune he'd accumulated by taking control of the diamonds and the gold mines of South Africa, and leaving it for a purpose, two purposes. One, a secret society, and the other for the Rhodes Scholarships, the Rhodes Trust. Upon Cecil Rhodes' death in 1902, control of the Rhodes Trust was taken over by a man named Lord Alfred Milner, who by 1917, 1918 was the most powerful man in England, but always working behind the scenes, never elected to office, but the man who really controlled what was going on. And he sent Bruce Lockhart, Lord Alfred Milner sent Bruce Lockhart to Russia to work with the communists who had just taken control. And of course, Lockhart writes that one of the strange things, he could never understand why it was that Lenin, the dictator of Russia, seemed to be so subservient and almost condescending, going along with anything that was suggested to him by American capitalists who were there. In fact, many of these seem to be related to the American Federal Reserve System. And he never understood why such things were going on. It didn't seem right that Lenin, the communist, would be so concerned working with the capitalists. And, of course, there are a number of other books that were written at that time. One of them is the autobiography of Sir George Buchanan. Sir George Buchanan was the English ambassador to St. Petersburg, to Russia, at the time of the Communist Revolution. And in his biography, he has about 10 pages talking about these foolish people who were saying that the English had financed the Russian Revolution. And, of course, he poo-poos the idea. But as you read what he has to say, you begin to say, well, gee, the French thought it happened, and this one and that one. And there's a great deal of evidence out there that the British were involved in financing the Russian Revolution to overthrow their ally in the First World War, which really didn't make sense because, of course, if Russia got out of the First World War, it would release the German troops from fighting on the Eastern Front so they could come to the West and kill more Britishers. But a lot of things in this whole story really don't make sense. The second book we list is Tsarism and Revolution, written by a Russian general who claims that Lord Milner was responsible for the Russian Revolution, the first revolution when Kerensky came to power. Then, of course, one of the most fascinating books is the bottom one, General Wrangel's Memoirs. And, of course, General Wrangel was the commander of the Army of the South, a white Russian army that was opposing the communists. And, of course, the Russian people did not want communism. They didn't want this kind of ruthless government that they saw even being enforced in St. Petersburg and other areas that the communists controlled. And so the Russian people were solidly behind General Wrangel, and he was winning battle after battle after battle. And he made one great tactical error, the same error that General Chiang Kai-shek was to make some years later. General Chiang Kai-shek became dependent upon America. General Wrangel became dependent upon the British for his supplies. And of course, he writes in his memoirs that, first of all, he buys airplanes. He's able to collect taxes from the people in the area he occupies, and he buys airplanes. And what do the English do but they sabotage his airplanes? And then they come to him and they say, you will withdraw or we'll cut off all of your ammunition and supplies, and all of your men will be killed because they'll have nothing to fight with. And so eventually he's forced to simply retreat because they cut off his munitions and war supplies. And he never understands why the British were so intent upon the defeat of the opposition to the communists. But then, of course, General Wrangel never understood that the most influential man in England at that time was Lord Alfred Milner, who had taken over the leadership of the Rhodes movement upon Rhodes' death in 1902. Well, then who does really control the Jewish banks of the world? Well, we could take Lazard brothers in Great Britain. certainly a very Jewish-sounding name, and yet for many, many years the CEO of Lazard Brothers was a Lord Brand. Name doesn't mean much to you, but you remember I told you about Lord Alfred Milner, who had taken control of the Round Table Group, the front for Cecil Rhodes' secret society. Well, upon Milner's death, the leadership of the Round Table Group, which was the front for that secret society, was taken over by Lord Brand, who actually led the Round Table up until the 1960s. We have here in the United States Lazard Brothers, certainly a very Jewish-sounding bank, and yet, pardon me, Lehman Brothers here in the United States, and yet for many years, Lehman Brothers was headed by a Greek named Pete Peterson, who just happened to be the director of the Council on Foreign Relations. And of course, the Goldman Sachs here in the United States, Goldman Sachs right at the present time has 5 Rhodes Scholars in key positions in banking. So much of what you have heard about the Jewish influence in banking really is not so. Now, there are many, many people, of course, who will try to convince you that the real culprit is the Catholic Church, specifically the Jesuits. And they will suggest that the Jesuits operate as a secret society, and it is the Jesuits' influence in South America that has led to the liberation theology and many of the revolutions there. And they're firmly convinced the Catholics are behind everything going on, or if not the Catholics as a whole, then the Knights of Malta, which is a rather secretive group made up of Catholic males. On the other hand, many of the Catholics will tell you that the real force behind what's going on in the world today are the Protestants, specifically a secret Protestant organization known as the Masons. And of course, there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that this is actually correct, because you will find, for instance, that most of America's founding fathers were Masons. The majority of the men who signed the Constitution were members of the craft. Washington, D.C. was laid out in a Masonic pattern, and those of you who've seen Bill Schneblin's videos will actually see pictures of Washington, D.C. and find out the street pattern is laid out in Masonic symbology. Every major building in Washington, D.C. has a Masonic plaque on it. But the most significant thing is that Freemasons controlled the United States Supreme Court from 1941 to 1971. And during that period of time, they took God out of our schools. Because you see, the Masons worship the great architect of the universe, the God of the Buddhist, the Brahmin, the Hindu, the Mohammedan, the Shintoite, the God of the whole world, but not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible is not the God of the Mohammedan and of the Hindu and of the Buddhist. And so what most people do not understand is that between 1941 and 1971, the Masons controlled the United States Supreme Court, began to centralize all power of Washington, D.C., undermining the very fabric of our constitutional concept of limiting the power of the federal government. 4 of the 6 Supreme Court justices who voted to take God out of our schools were Masons. That was Tom Clark, William O. Douglas, Earl Warren, and Black. In other words, the Masons were responsible for taking God out of our schools, and they did it intentionally because they've always wanted to create a wall of separation between church and state. And I suggest that probably most of you have never heard that. It's never mentioned by conservative organizations across America, and you might ask yourself why that would be. Now, if you talk to Masons, they will point to the symbol on the back of the dollar bill, and they will tell you that is a Masonic symbol. And of course, they will use this in many of their publications, and they claim that this pyramid capped by the all-seeing eye is indeed a Masonic symbol. Now, I've never met a Mason I didn't like, so how do you explain what they are doing? Well, let me tell you what Manly P. Hall has said. Now, Manly P. Hall, you remember we started our program this evening talking about Manly P. Hall, the most distinguished and important Masonic philosopher of modern times. And in his book, The Lectures on Ancient Philosophy, written in 1929, he said this: Freemasonry is a fraternity within a fraternity, an outer organization concealing an inner brotherhood of the elect. It's necessary to establish the existence of these 2 separate yet independent orders, the one visible, the other invisible. The visible society is a splendid camaraderie of free and accepted men enjoying to devote themselves to ethical, educational, fraternal, patriotic, and humanitarian concerns. But the invisible society is a secret and most august fraternity, whose members are dedicated to the service of the mysterious arcanum, arcandrum, a secret or mystery. In each generation, only a very few are accepted into the inner sanctuary of the work. One of the better books on this is Behind the Lodge Door by Paul Fisher, and he tells you without any question that between 1941 and 1971, the Supreme Court was dominated by Masons in ratios of 5 to 4 to 8 to 1. During that 30-year period, the court erected a wall separating things religious from things secular. It was an epoch when prayer and Bible reading were deracinated from public education, and when decisions after decisions succeeded in prohibiting any state financial assistance to religious schools. And nobody ever talks about it, and I wonder why. Well, of course, the magazine that was put out by the Masons for many years was known as the New Age magazine. Some years ago, they stopped calling it New Age. They call it now the Shrine Journal, because there was another New Age magazine to denote a new movement within America called the New Age, or sometimes the Aquarian Conspiracy. This is a book about the Aquarian Conspiracy, about the New Age movement. You'll notice this logo on the front. If you look very carefully, you'll notice the 3 6s intertwined. And in that book, Marilyn Ferguson, who is dedicated to this purpose, tells us what it's all about. And she tells us that a leaderless but powerful network is working to bring about radical change in the United States. Its members have broken with certain key elements of Western thought. They may even have broken continuity with history. This network is the Aquarian Conspiracy. It's a conspiracy without a political doctrine, without a manifesto, with conspirators who seek power only to disperse it, and whose strategies are pragmatic, even scientific, but whose perspectives sound so mystical that they hesitate to discuss it. Activists asking different kinds of questions, challenging the establishment from within. She names among the people associated with this movement Zygmunt Brzezinski, who was actually recruited by David Rockefeller to organize the Trilateral Commission.